You can't stay here.
I understand.
Go on then.
He didn't ask for much, just a cup of water and a place to sit before the sun took the last of his strength. But the family standing on that porch looked at his cracked hands, his torn coat, the dust caked into the lines of his face, and they saw nothing worth their time. The man who owned the house didn't even rise from his chair. He waved his hand like he was swatting a fly, and told the old man to get off his land before he called someone to remove him. The old man didn't argue. He simply nodded, turned, and began to walk away, slower than a man his age should have had to walk. What none of them knew, what none of them could have possibly imagined, was that by sundown the whole town would know his name, and every single person who had laughed that afternoon would spend the rest of their lives wishing they hadn't. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. The town was called Millbrook Hollow, a quiet stretch of farmland and family-owned stores, where everybody knew everybody, or believed they did. It was the kind of place where reputation mattered more than money, where a family's name could open doors or close them depending on who you asked. And at the top of that town's invisible ladder sat the Voss family. Harlan Voss owned the largest stretch of farmland in 3 counties, along with the feed store, half the lumber mill, and enough influence to get a man fired from his job with a single phone call. His wife, Corinne, ran the town's social calendar like a general running a campaign. Together, they had built something people admired and feared in equal measure, and their children had grown up believing the world simply bent around people like them. Dalton Voss, the eldest son, had inherited his father's temper and his mother's sharp tongue, a dangerous combination in a young man who had never once been told no. His younger sister, Willa, was quieter, but no less shaped by the family's pride. She had learned early that kindness was something you extended carefully, and only to people who could do something for you in return. The Voss family gave generously to the church building fund, hosted the biggest barbecue of the summer, and sat in the front pew every Sunday. And most of the town had long since stopped noticing the difference between their reputation and the truth of who they actually were behind closed doors. That morning had started like any other. Harlan was reviewing feed prices on the porch when Dalton came storming out about a delivery that was running late, and Corinne was inside arguing with a caterer over the wrong shade of tablecloth for an upcoming dinner. It was an ordinary kind of chaos, the sort that fills a busy household, and none of them noticed the figure walking slowly up their long gravel driveway until he was close enough to call out. He was an old man, thin beneath his coat, with a walking stick worn smooth from years of use. His boots were held together more by hope than leather. He asked, quietly and without complaint, if he might trouble them for a little water and a moment's rest in the shade. Dalton was the first to respond, and he responded the way he responded to most things that inconvenienced him, with contempt dressed up as humor. He asked the old man if he'd wandered off from somewhere he wasn't supposed to leave, and laughed at his own joke loud enough for his father to hear and smile along. Harlan didn't correct his son. He didn't offer water either. Instead, he told the man plainly that this was private property and that folks like him needed to keep moving before somebody called the sheriff. The old man's eyes lingered on Harlan for a moment longer than seemed necessary, as though he were memorizing something. But his voice stayed calm, and even when he spoke again, he said he understood and that he would trouble them no further. But before he turned to leave, he said something strange, something none of them paid attention to at the time. He told them that a man's true wealth was revealed not in how he treated his equals, but in how he treated those who could offer him nothing in return. Corinne, who had stepped outside just in time to hear it, rolled her eyes and muttered something about vagrants thinking they were philosophers. Willa said nothing at all, though something in the old man's tone made her uneasy in a way she couldn't quite name. Dalton, meanwhile, had already turned back toward the house, done with the interruption entirely. What happened next would be repeated in Millbrook Hollow for years afterward, told and retold until the details blurred into something closer to legend. As the old man made his way back down the driveway, Dalton, wanting to impress a friend who had just pulled up, whistled for the family's dogs and let them loose toward the gate, laughing as the old man quickened his pace to stay ahead of them. The old man didn't run. He simply walked faster, gripping his stick, glancing back once with an expression that wasn't fear so much as quiet disappointment. The friend filmed it on his phone, thinking it was funny, thinking it was nothing, thinking the old man was nobody at all. He was nobody, as far as they knew, just another stranger passing through. One of dozens who wandered through Millbrook Hollow every year looking for work on the farms or a warm meal at the church pantry. Nobody stopped to ask his name. Nobody wondered where he'd come from or where he was walking to. Dressed the way he was, moving the way he moved, like a man who had once known comfort and had lost it, or like a man who had chosen to give it up entirely. The video that Dalton's friend recorded would end up online by nightfall, posted as a joke, shared a handful of times among people who found it amusing that an old vagrant had been run off a rich family's land. By the time the sun began to dip behind the tree line, the old man had reached the edge of town, footsore and thirsty, and sat down on a bench outside the small diner that had served Millbrook Hollow for 3 generations. The diner's owner, a widow named Ruthie Calloway, noticed him through the window and did something none of the Voss family had thought to do. She brought him a glass of water without being asked, and a plate of whatever was left warm in the kitchen, and she sat with him for a few minutes while he ate, asking nothing of him in return, expecting nothing back. It was the kind of small kindness that costs a person almost nothing, and yet changes everything. The old man thanked her, and told her that her kindness would not be forgotten. Ruthie laughed it off gently, the way people do when they've done something decent and don't expect credit for it, telling him it was the least she could do for a tired traveler. But something in the way he said it stayed with her afterward, a certainty in his voice that felt less like gratitude and more like a promise. He finished his meal, thanked her once more, and told her he needed to send word to some men waiting for him a few miles outside of town. Ruthie assumed he meant family, or perhaps a work crew. She had no idea how wrong that assumption would turn out to be. It was nearly dark when 3 black vehicles rolled slowly into Millbrook Hollow, moving with the kind of quiet authority that made people stop what they were doing and watch. They parked outside the diner, and several men in dark suits stepped out, scanning the street with the practiced calm of people used to being obeyed. Ruthie, still cleaning up behind the counter, watched through the window as the men approached the old man, and what she saw next made her forget the dish towel still in her hands. Every single one of them bowed, not a nod, not a handshake, a full and deliberate bow, the kind reserved for royalty, the kind nobody in Millbrook Hollow had ever seen given to anyone in their lives. Word spreads fast in small towns, and it spread faster than usual that night. Within an hour, half of Millbrook Hollow had heard some version of the story, each one slightly more exaggerated than the last, but all of them circling the same impossible truth. The old man who had been shooed off the Voss family's porch, who had been chased by their dogs while their son laughed and filmed it for entertainment, was not a wandering nobody at all. He was King Elias Render, ruler of a small but wealthy nation overseas, a man whose family had held power for 6 generations, currently touring the region incognito to see, in his own words, what kind of people his hosts truly were when they believed no one important was watching. Nobody in Millbrook Hollow could quite explain how a king had ended up walking dusty back roads in torn boots, but the details began to surface over the following days. King Elias had made a habit, throughout his reign, of disguising himself during diplomatic visits, choosing to travel not as royalty but as an ordinary traveler, believing that the truest measure of a place wasn't found in the banquets thrown in his honor, but in how strangers treated him when they assumed he was worthless. He had done it in a dozen countries before. Millbrook Hollow was simply the latest stop, and the Voss family, without knowing it, had just failed a test they never even realized they were taking. Harlan Voss found out the way most of the town did, through a phone call from a business associate who'd seen the video online and recognized the emblem on one of the black vehicles now parked outside the local diner. He didn't believe it at first, laughed it off the way he laughed off most things that threatened his sense of control, until his associate sent him a photograph confirming the royal seal. Harlan felt something cold settle into his stomach, the particular dread of a man realizing that the ground beneath his feet was no longer solid. He thought immediately of every deal he had pending with international investors, every handshake he'd hoped would open doors overseas, all of it suddenly hanging by a thread he hadn't known existed. Corinne's reaction was different, but no less desperate. Her mind went straight to the town's perception of them, the whispers that would follow, the embarrassment of being the family who mocked a king and got caught doing it on camera. She began making calls almost immediately, trying to find someone, anyone, who might know how to reach the king's staff and arrange an apology before the story spread any further than it already had. She didn't yet understand that the story had already left Millbrook Hollow entirely, picked up by a regional news outlet within hours, then a national one by morning, the headline practically writing itself. Wealthy family humiliates disguised king, unaware of who they were dealing with. Dalton, for his part, seemed to grasp the weight of it slower than his parents did, the way young men often do when consequences haven't caught up to their actions yet. He deleted the video from his friend's social media the moment he understood what it meant, though by then it had already been downloaded, reposted, and shared thousands of times by people who couldn't believe what they were watching. He tried calling his father for guidance and got a voice that sounded nothing like the confident man who had raised him, a voice thin with fear, telling him not to talk to anyone, not the press, not the neighbors, not anybody, until they figured out exactly how much trouble they were actually in. Willa was the only one in the family who didn't reach for a phone or a plan. She sat quietly on the porch steps where the old man had stood hours earlier, replaying his words in her mind, the ones about wealth being measured in how you treat those who can offer nothing back. She hadn't laughed with her brother. She hadn't said anything cruel, but she hadn't said anything kind either. And that silence sat heavier on her now than any insult could have. She wondered, sitting there in the dark, whether staying quiet while someone else was cruel made a person any less responsible for the cruelty. And she didn't like the answers she kept arriving at. By the next morning, Millbrook Hollow was unrecognizable. News vans lined the main road, reporters standing outside the diner where Ruthie Calloway now found herself unexpectedly famous, praised online as the only person in town who had shown the king any decency at all. Her small, quiet act, a glass of water and a warm plate of food offered without expectation, was being held up across the internet as an example of what basic human kindness should look like, and offers began pouring in, from investors wanting to fund a renovation of her diner, to reporters wanting her story, to strangers simply wanting to thank her for restoring a little bit of their faith in people. The Voss family, meanwhile, watched their name become something closer to a punchline than a point of pride. Business partners who had once eagerly returned Harlan's calls suddenly went quiet. A land deal he'd been finalizing for months fell through without explanation, though everyone understood the real reason well enough. Corinne's social calendar emptied overnight, invitations rescinded, phone calls unanswered, the very people who had once fought for a seat at her dinner table now pretending they barely knew her. It wasn't punishment handed down by any court or government. It was something quieter and in some ways crueler, the slow, deliberate withdrawal of a community that had decided, almost unanimously, that it no longer wanted to be associated with what the Voss name now represented. 3 days after the incident, a formal request arrived at the Voss family home, delivered not by mail but by one of the king's own staff, asking that the family present themselves for an audience with King Elias before he departed the region. The tone of the letter was polite, even gracious, but there was no mistaking the weight behind it. Harlan wanted to refuse, some prideful part of him insisting they had nothing to apologize for, that the old man had trespassed first, that none of this would have happened if he'd simply kept walking like he was told. But even Harlan understood, somewhere beneath his pride, that refusing wasn't an option anymore, not with cameras still parked outside their gate and the entire country watching to see what they would do next. They arrived at the estate the king had been staying in on the outskirts of town, a modest property compared to what he was accustomed to, chosen deliberately, it seemed, to continue the same disguise he'd worn all along. Harlan walked in with his chin high, rehearsing some version of an explanation in his head, something about misunderstandings and hospitality customs, and the simple fact that they hadn't known. Corinne walked beside him with the practiced composure of a woman used to smoothing over disasters with charm alone. Dalton trailed behind them, quieter than either of his parents had seen him in years. Willa walked last, and unlike the rest of her family, she wasn't thinking about what to say. She was thinking about what she should have said 3 days earlier, when it still would have mattered. King Elias received them not in the grand hall the estate offered, but in a small sitting room, seated in the same plain clothes he'd worn on their porch, as if to remind them exactly who they were speaking to. He listened patiently as Harlan began his explanation, the words about hospitality and misunderstanding falling flatter with every sentence, until the king raised a single hand, gently, and Harlan's voice trailed off mid-sentence. The king said he hadn't summoned them for an apology, though he would certainly listen if they had one worth giving. He'd summoned them because he wanted to understand something, plainly and honestly, and he wanted them to understand it too, before he decided what came next for their family and their standing in this town. He asked Harlan a simple question. Would he have treated an old traveler differently if he'd known who he truly was? Harlan hesitated, and in that hesitation, everyone in the room heard the answer before he ever spoke a word of it. The king nodded slowly, as though he'd expected exactly that silence, and told them that this was precisely the problem, not with them specifically, but with a kind of thinking he had encountered again and again, across every corner of the world he'd visited in disguise. People saved their kindness for those who could repay it, and reserved their cruelty for those who couldn't, and called the result good manners as long as no one who mattered was watching them do it. He turned next to Dalton, and his voice, though still calm, carried an edge it hadn't held with Harlan. He asked the young man whether he found it funny, watching an old, frightened stranger run from dogs he had personally set loose. Dalton, for the first time in longer than he could remember, had no clever response waiting. He looked at the floor and admitted, quietly, that it hadn't felt funny at all, once he understood what had actually happened. That it had felt like something he wished he could take back the moment he realized the video was out there for the world to see, though he wasn't proud enough yet to say it had felt wrong, even before he knew who the man really was. Corinne tried once to interject, something about how the family had always supported the community, always given to the church, always shown up for the town's causes, as though generosity toward people who could see and applaud it somehow balanced out cruelty toward someone who couldn't. The king listened politely, then said something that would follow the Voss family for years afterward, repeated in town long after the news cameras had packed up and gone home. He told her that charity given for recognition was simply a transaction wearing kindness as a disguise, and that the only gift that meant anything was the one given when nobody was there to applaud it, or to film it, or to tell the world about it afterward. Willa was the last to speak, and unlike the rest of her family, she didn't offer an excuse. She told the king plainly that she hadn't laughed, hadn't mocked him, hadn't set the dogs loose, but that she also hadn't said a single word to stop any of it, and that her silence, looking back, felt like its own kind of cruelty now that she understood what it had cost. The king studied her for a long moment before responding, and when he did, his tone had softened slightly, the first real change in his demeanor since the family had walked through the door. He told her that recognizing silence as complicity was the beginning of something most people in that room hadn't yet managed to understand, and that it mattered more than she realized. He didn't hand down a punishment that day, not in the way the family had braced themselves for. There would be no lawsuit, no formal condemnation from his government, nothing that would follow them through the courts. Instead, the consequence he chose was quieter and, in its own way, far more lasting, he announced publicly, through a brief statement released to the press waiting outside, that his nation would be reconsidering certain trade partnerships in the region, citing concerns about the character and values of the local business community, without naming the Voss family directly, though everyone understood exactly who and what he meant. Harlan's pending deals, the ones he had spent years building toward, quietly and permanently disappeared, one by one, over the following weeks. But the king's final act surprised the town more than anything that had come before it. He announced that he would be funding a full renovation of Ruthie Calloway's diner, along with a scholarship program in her name for young people in Millbrook Hollow who couldn't otherwise afford to continue their education, funded entirely by his own family's private wealth rather than government money. He said, in a brief statement that would be quoted for years afterward, that he wanted the world to remember what happened in this town, not for the cruelty of a single afternoon, but for the kindness of a woman who had nothing to gain and gave anyway, because that, in the end, was worth more than any apology the Voss family could ever offer him. Ruthie Calloway didn't ask for any of it. When the news reached her, delivered in person by one of the king's staff, she reportedly sat down at one of her own diner's booths and cried. Not from excitement, but from a kind of disbelief that something so small, a glass of water, a warm plate of food, could ripple outward into something so enormous. Her diner reopened 8 months later, fully renovated, its walls lined with photographs of the town's history, and a small plaque near the door that read simply, "Kindness costs nothing and returns everything." Unsigned, though everyone in Millbrook Hollow knew exactly who had chosen those words and why. The Voss family never fully recovered their former standing, not because anyone actively worked against them, but because the story had changed how the town saw them, and stories like that are hard to undo once they've settled into a community's memory. Harlan sold off part of the farmland within the year, his business ties overseas permanently severed. Corinne stopped hosting the parties she'd once been famous for, finding fewer and fewer people willing to attend. Dalton, to his credit, seemed genuinely changed by the experience, volunteering quietly at Ruthie's diner during its renovation, though he never spoke publicly about why, as if some part of him understood that explaining it would defeat the purpose of doing it at all. Willa was the one who changed most visibly. She began volunteering with the scholarship program the king had funded, working directly with the young people it was meant to help. And over the following years, she became something of a quiet fixture in Millbrook Hollow's efforts to support its poorest families, never mentioning the porch, or the dogs, or the old man's words, though those closest to her understood exactly where her sense of purpose had come from. She never sought recognition for it, and in a strange, quiet way, that seemed to be the entire point. The lesson she alone and her family had actually absorbed from the king's brief, unassuming visit to their town. King Elias Render never returned to Millbrook Hollow, though the story of his visit was retold for years afterward, growing slightly with each telling the way these stories always do, until people could no longer agree on every detail, only on the truth at the center of it. A king had walked into their town disguised as a nobody, and the town had shown him, without meaning to, exactly who they really were underneath their reputations and their Sunday best. Some had failed that test in ways they would spend years trying to undo. One woman had passed it without even realizing a test was happening at all, simply because kindness, for her, had never required an audience to begin with. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's a question worth sitting with, long after the screen goes dark. How would you have treated that old man on the porch? If you didn't know, if you couldn't know, exactly who he really was? Would you have offered him water? Or would you have reached for the dogs? Would you have judged him by his boots? Or by the words he chose when nobody powerful was standing beside him? Somewhere out there, right now, someone is being underestimated the exact same way. And the only person who'll ever know how that story ends is the one deciding, in this very moment, how they choose to treat them. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 3 weeks earlier, in a country most people in Millbrook Hollow couldn't have found on a map, King Elias Render had sat in a private meeting with his closest advisors, informing them of his intention to travel again, alone, the way he had done a dozen times before. His advisors, as always, objected. They reminded him of the risks, the unpredictability of traveling without security, the embarrassment it would cause if word got out that their king was wandering foreign roads dressed like a beggar. Elias listened to every objection the same way he always did, patiently, respectfully, and then reminded them of the same truth he had built his entire reign around. A crown could make people bow. It could never make them decent. If he wanted to know which one his allies actually were, he would have to see it for himself, without the crown in the room. He had done this since he was a young man, long before he inherited the throne from his father, who had done the same thing before him. It had started almost by accident, during a diplomatic visit decades earlier, when a delayed carriage forced him to walk the last few miles into a neighboring town alone, dressed plainly, unrecognized. What he witnessed that day, the difference between how people treated him as an anonymous traveler versus how they treated him once his identity was revealed had disturbed him enough that he made it a habit. Not a test, he announced. Not a game he played for entertainment. A quiet, private way of understanding the true character of the places his country did business with, the families his advisors recommended, the towns being considered for investment and partnership. Millbrook Hollow had been recommended to him 3 months prior by a trade delegation eager to establish a partnership with several of the town's larger landowners, Harlan Voss chief among them. The paperwork made the Voss family sound like ideal partners, respected, wealthy, deeply rooted in their community, generous contributors to local charity. On paper, they were exactly the kind of family his advisors wanted him to align with. But Elias had learned, over many years and many towns, that paperwork rarely told the truth about a person's character, and the only way to learn it was to walk into their lives as nobody at all and watch what happened when nobody important was supposedly watching. He had arrived in the region 4 days before the incident on the porch, staying first in a small inn on the outskirts of the county, observing quietly, speaking to shopkeepers and farmhands, learning the shape of the town before he ever set foot near the Voss estate. He had heard, more than once, how respected the family was, how much they gave to the church, how well they were spoken of at the county fair. He had also noticed, in the small ways that mattered more to him than reputation ever could, how a farmhand flinched slightly when Harlan Voss's name came up, how a young cashier at the feed store lowered her voice before mentioning that Dalton Voss wasn't quite as pleasant behind closed doors as he was in front of a camera. Small things. The kind of things reputations were built to hide. Among the reporters who descended on Millbrook Hollow was a young journalist named Denise Marsh, who had been covering small-town stories for a regional outlet for nearly 6 years without a single piece of hers ever reaching a national audience. She arrived the morning after the video went viral, notebook in hand, expecting a quick human interest piece about an embarrassing viral moment. What she found instead, after 2 days of quiet conversations with people around town, was something far larger than a single afternoon of cruelty caught on camera. She learned, speaking to former employees at the feed store and the lumber mill, that the Voss family's reputation for generosity had always come with conditions attached. Quiet expectations of loyalty, gratitude, and public praise in return for whatever help they offered. One former employee, speaking only if his name was left out of the article, told Denise about the time Harlan had donated heavily to a family whose barn had burned down, only to call in that same favor 18 months later, expecting a vote in his favor during a contentious zoning dispute that would benefit his own land. Another woman described how Corinne's famous charity dinners always seemed to circle back to conversations about who among the guests could be useful to the family's various business interests. None of it was illegal. None of it was even unusual by the standards of small-town politics, but collected together, printed side by side with the footage of an old man being chased by dogs. It painted a picture of a family whose kindness had always been a kind of currency, spent carefully, and never given away for free. Denise's article ran 3 days after the initial video, and it did what the video alone never could have done. It reframed the entire incident, not as a single embarrassing mistake, but as the natural conclusion of a family that had spent years mistaking transactional generosity for genuine character. The piece was picked up nationally within hours, shared far beyond the reach of the original video, and for the first time in the family's long history in Millbrook Hollow, people outside the family's carefully managed circle of loyalty began asking questions nobody had thought to ask before. Denise, for her part, received the recognition she'd spent 6 years chasing, though she would later say in interviews that the story had never really been about her at all, that she'd simply been the one who finally wrote down what half the town had quietly known for years. The scholarship program funded in Ruthie's name grew faster than anyone anticipated, expanding within 3 years to cover students in 4 surrounding counties. Funded partly by King Elias's continued private contributions, and partly by donations that poured in from strangers around the country, who had followed the story and wanted to be part of something that felt, for once, like real justice rather than the internet's usual fleeting outrage. One of its earliest recipients, a young man named Marcus Ely, who had grown up 2 streets over from the Voss estate, went on to study agricultural law, driven in part, he later admitted, by watching what had happened to a family who believed their wealth put them above basic decency. He would return to Millbrook Hollow years later as a lawyer, ironically representing several of the smaller farms that Harlan Voss's business practices had once quietly squeezed out of the market. Ruthie Calloway continued running her diner well into her 70s, refusing every offer to expand into a chain or franchise, the story that had made her briefly famous. She told a local reporter, years after the initial frenzy had died down, that she'd never done anything special that day, that she'd simply given a tired old man a glass of water, the way her own mother had taught her to treat anyone who walked through her door, king or otherwise. She kept the small plaque by her entrance for the rest of her life, and new residents moving into Millbrook Hollow would often ask about it and be told, in varying versions, the story of the day a king walked quietly into their town and left, having taught all of them something none of them had asked to learn.